The nervous system is divided into two main systems, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system consists of a somatic nervous system, which is under voluntary control. That includes the sensory and motor nerves, and the autonomic nervous system, which is under involuntary control. It consists of the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, part of the ANS system, is very active during the fight or flight response, whereas the parasympathetic system is more active during rest and digest parts of the system. It takes two neurons from the central nervous system to reach the effectors that are innervated by the ANS system. The first neuron is called the preganglionic neuron for both the parasympathetic and sympathetic system, and the second neuron is called the postganglionic nerve. You notice the preganglionic neuron for the sympathetic system is shorter than the parasympathetic preganglionic neuron, whereas the postganglionic neuron for the parasympathetic system is shorter than the postganglionic neuron for the sympathetic nervous system. An action potential will travel along the preganglionic neurons and reach the synaptic terminals and release a neurotransmitter. All preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system are cholinergic. This means they make and release acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter. The postganglionic nerves of the parasympathetic nervous system are also cholinergic. Meaning they also release acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter. This is also true of the somatic nervous system, which are also cholinergic and innervate the skeletal muscle, releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system is called an adrenergic neuron. And these guys release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine and epinephrine. Cholinergic receptors for acetylcholine are located in several places. They are located on the cell bodies or dendrites of the postganglionic neurons. These cholinergic receptors are called nicotinic receptors or N2 receptors on the postganglionic nerves. The cholinergic receptors located in the effector organs are known as the muscarinic receptors or M receptors. Effectors innervated by the somatic motor neurons are known as skeletal muscles, and they also express acetylcholine receptors. These receptors are called nicotinic receptors or N1 receptors. The adrenergic receptors located on the effectors innervated by the sympathetic nervous system are known as alpha and beta receptors. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, is released by the adrenal glands, and this also releases this epinephrine, which will go and bind to these adrenergic effectors. It's also important to note that the actions of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are in opposition to one another. This is, I guess, in a sense, how the body maintains homeostasis. For example, the heart, the parasympathetic nervous system slows down the heart rate, whereas the sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart rate. This is also very true of most other organs throughout the body that are innervated by both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. This is known as the dual autonomic innervation. It's also important to note that one receptor subtype from each system tends to dominate in a tissue. For example, the cardiac myocytes predominantly have beta-1 receptors located in the heart cells, whereas the smooth muscles of the airways are predominantly lined by beta-2 receptors. And lastly, the alpha-1 receptors are the ones that are lining the blood vessels. Now, there are exceptions to this dual autonomic nervous system rule. For example, the majority of the blood vessels do not have parasympathetic innervation, only lined by the sympathetic nervous system. Another exception is found in the sweat glands. Sweat glands also lack parasympathetic innervation, and these are exclusively innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. Postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. The one exception to the rule is the sweat glands. The sympathetic nervous system postganglionic receptors supplying the generalized sweat glands are innervated by cholinergic receptors, releasing acetylcholine. If you remember, the sympathetic system typically releases norepinephrine and epinephrine by the adrenergic receptors, not the cholinergic. Once acetylcholine is released, it will bind to the generalized sweat glands via the muscarinic receptors, and this is going to be very important for maintaining body temperature. Now, we also do have localized sweat glands that are activated by stress. These are located in the palms, soles, genitalia, and the armpits throughout the body. And these guys express alpha-1 receptors, and they respond to norepinephrine. It's also important to note that all adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta, along with all muscarinic receptors, are G protein coupled receptors. This allows them to be either excitatory or inhibitory. This is in contrast to all nicotinic receptors, which are not G protein coupled receptors. Their activation will increase permeability of sodium and calcium in postganglionic neurons. This is in skeletal muscles, and these guys are always excitatory. In summary, cholinergic neurons release acetylcholine, whereas adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine and epinephrine. Also important to remember that all autonomic nervous system neurons are cholinergic, except postganglionic, sympathetic, and these guys are adrenergic. Lastly, make sure you guys review the cholinergic receptors as well as the adrenergic receptors and their respective locations.